Okay, all set.
And again, everyone, welcome.
Okay, all set.
And again, everyone, welcome to today's presentation with Dr. Patrícia Cornille. She has over 30 years of clinical experience as an occupational therapist and is a passionate expert in understanding the connection of the brain and everyday behavior. She's the founder and clinical director of VitaCura Services and the president of the Global Action Coalition for Dementia, Mental Health, and Cognitive Disability. Both of those organizations provide high-quality services for individuals living with or at risk of dementia. Dr. Cornille is also the past president of the Aula Cognitive Network. She trained and mentored thousands of healthcare professionals, students, and caregivers on the use of the cognitive disabilities model, known as CDM, nationally and internationally. She has worked extensively with the author of the CDM, Claudia K. Allen, and she's used the model in clinical research, program development, and education in a variety of settings. Dr. Cornille received her doctorate at Creighton University, where she focused on dementia care and lifestyle medicine, and studied occupational science at the Karolinska Institute. She's a graduate of the Brain Longevity Therapy Training Program through the Alzheimer's Research and Prevention Foundation, and she's a certified Montessori dementia care professional. So without me taking any more time, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Cornille. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you everyone for coming today. I'm grateful to share this information and very excited to share my experiences with you in a two-part series. And dementia is a topic near and dear to my heart as an occupational therapist in the field for many, many years. At the onset of my career, uh, dementia wasn't in the fore, but we were seeing it. And as time went on, more and more people were coming to us with dementia. And now we know that it is a leading global health and social challenge. And here in the United States, we have over 6 million people who are living with it. We don't have an available cure, and it's expected to nearly double by 2020. Um, and many people additionally have symptoms, but they're not diagnosed. I think I could write a book just on that topic right there. And also, many people are diagnosed, but they're not aware of it, or they're not getting the right kind of help or enough help. And again, that's another topic that we could spend all day on because many, many people who come in to see us are having symptoms, diagnoses, but they're in a crisis and they don't know why. Caregivers experience a lot of stress. They have a lot of health issues. Individuals, many have challenging behaviors, which include lead to high healthcare costs, placement, caregiver stress, staff burnout. They have higher incidence of falls and hospitalizations. Some people even say this illness can bankrupt our healthcare system. And we are in a situation where we're in a crisis and we can't act fast enough. And personalized interventions that can transform the lives of these people and their families. And we can maximize cognition, decrease those associated symptoms, reduce crisis, improve the safety, and improve the quality of life. And today and next week, that's what we're going to talk about, how the Allen Cognitive Disability Model can support the best practices and can contribute to caring for these individuals. And as we all know, the COVID pandemic has really placed a whole nother level of challenge with these individuals and their caregivers, especially with the social connection and participation. So today we're going to talk about the history and development of the model and in dementia care. And I'm going to talk about a little insight about Claudia Allen's process in developing the model and some of the foundational components that underlie it. And I really think that understanding those components there's a wide range of using this model. And if you get it aligned in the right context, you can use it in a little way and have a big outcome, or you can carry it over to high level assessment, intervention, and training. So we're going to talk about that. And then I'm going to describe the 6 cognitive levels and their association with dementia and also with the mild cognitive impairment. And then finally, we'll identify and talk about some of the assessments and skilled observations to determine each cognitive level. In part 2, we're going to take a deeper dive and we're going to get into some of the evidence-based approaches, some of the big studies, and then a lot of details about intervention, both with the person and in organizational context. So what is the Allen Cognitive Disability Model? And it is a theory and evidence-based approach that it guides evaluation and intervention with people who have cognitive disabilities. There's 6 levels. This is the famous scale. And these are the ordinal levels, with level 6 being no cognitive impairment and level 1 being a profound cognitive impairment. And within that level, we have sensory cues that are ordered as well. And we're going to talk about this later, but you can see in level 6, a person can process the symbolic cues. And as we go down, it's more external concrete cues of visual and um, verbal cues, and then it becomes proprioceptive and subliminal. So we have 2 hierarchical models and scales happening. So the model is concerned with learning, with an individual's ability to do activities safely and a person's capacity to learn to adapt to disability. So that's what we're assessing when we do our assessments. And it's based on a biopsychosocial approach. And this is how Claudia would explain this approach in a can do, will do, may do format. And she had this little tippet man, and in the back here, my colleague got this for me. I never could find the tippet man, and some people don't even know that game from Milton Bradley, but it represents what we're trying to do when we use this model. And the can do is the biological part of understanding what the person's capacity is. And the will do looks at things that are more psychological in nature, what the person is motivated to do, what they want to do, what their interests are. And the may do is how the environment, whether it's the physical environment or the social environment, supports the person in their ability to do what they're able to do and also what they want to do. And Claudia always said that just because a person wants to do something, it doesn't always cancel out the ability that maybe they don't have the capacity to do it. But when these 3 things are not in balance, now the person has more difficulties, more dysfunction. They're at higher risk for accidents, illness, injury. And so, what we're trying to do is keep this in balance. And sometimes within the model, that has been referred to the just right challenge. So, it's a very holistic model. And all intervention approaches in the model are designed to promote the fit between activity demands of valued activities and what is cognitively realistic, the can do, and what is relevant, the will do, and how the environment promotes that. So here's a picture of Claudia Allen. And when we started with occupational therapy, many of you are occupational therapists, our profession was born in the moral treatment era when individuals with mental illness were misunderstood. We did not have the DSM-5. They did not know how to diagnose it. And our profession was born out of psychiatry, with three psychiatrists coming together and forming occupational therapy. And that was at the turn of the century. So Claudia started her career in the 1960s, and she first was working with children in a school, and she observed that many children with cognitive difficulties had the same expectations as children who didn't. And she noted a lot of frustration with the children and a lot of staff quitting the job because of that. She went on to work as a therapist at Eastern Pennsylvania Psychiatric Institute, and many of the people there had persistent mental illness and dementia. And she was taken aback at how they languished, the hours of time with nothing to do. She has a quote saying that that lack of time of not being engaged is a slow form of torture. And in that setting, it was a teaching setting. So she had to educate doctors and healthcare professionals and interns. And I interviewed Claudia for one of my doctorate projects on this history of the model. And I asked her, I said, well, Claudia, what was OT doing? And she said, well, at that time in mental health, a lot of the interpretation was through Freud, and OT was doing craft activities. She said she made hundreds of ashtrays um, with these individuals, and she noted differences in how they were performing and making the ashtrays. She said she couldn't explain it under a Freudian um, way. And she said if they were painting it red, it would be interpreted that they were angry, or if it was yellow, they were happy. And so she started reading the literature, and she observed these behaviors um, similar to children. And she read about Piaget's model of sensory motor development, and that was the foundation for building the six cognitive levels. She later went on to add information processing into that to better explain the behavior in the adult population. But I think the striking feature about Claudia was her passion for this population and her dedication to saying we needed a theory and occupational therapy that explained what we did, and understanding task analysis, task equivalence, underlying cognitive processes. And she really emphasized the social consequences of disability and gave the profession of language of explaining that maybe these behaviors weren't bizarre or unusual, but maybe we could describe them more objectively and compassionately. He talked about patients being described as unmotivated, uncooperative, not being responsive, expected to perform beyond their abilities. Um, 20 years later, in her famous Eleanor Clark Slagle lecture, she still described this happening. And I say today, we still struggle with this, and especially with the dementia population. Within the foundational framework, therapists could make logical inferences about cognitive functional capacities by observing the actions and the use of objects. It did not involve a language-based component. And she looked at that as part of doing meaningful activities with varied activity demands and levels of complexity. So in her lecture, Occupational Therapy's Treatment Method, she talked about these task or activity demands and the components and acts and aspects required to carry those out. But she was doing the task analysis by the cognitive complexity of the activity and the demands. So we talk about the term task equivalence or activity equivalence is when we know that the cognitive complexity and the activity demands can match each other or predict that performance in other environments. And I always would say, for those of you who understand some of this or talk about this, but some of the assessment of leather lacing, how do how did Claudia Allen and her colleagues go from developing a leather lacing assessment and being able to predict performance in all these areas? There is a lot of what we call ecological validity with this model because of that, that when we interpret it, it's not just based on one assessment or one observation in a controlled setting. We take into context many factors. So Alan believed, and I believe that this right here, she was way ahead of her time because she said engaging current cognitive and functional capacities and valued activities was a worthwhile therapeutic objective. And there is a growing body of evidence in the dementia um, intervention literature talking about non-pharmacological approaches with engagement and activity in especially in helping with challenging behaviors. And next week, we're going to go through many of those programs and evidence-based approaches. So the role of activity becomes a really important part of this model and what we're doing. And here's an example of some of the evidence. Um, like I said, next week we'll talk a lot, but the tailored activity program that started back probably in about 2008. And the first study was based in the home environment with people living with dementia who were having challenging behaviors. The caregivers were stressed, and the authors cited that these were leading reasons why people go into placement. So they use the Allen level to determine the person's abilities. They selected tasks that were meaningful, and they did an activity prescription. They trained the caregiver, they carried that over into other routines, and they had significant results in reducing caregiver stress, the time they felt that they were on duty, and reducing the challenging behaviors. Now this study is replicated in different contexts. It's used in different countries. And next week, I'm gonna share some more examples about evidence-based approach using this and outcomes that we've received. So here's just a picture that illustrates this. And I'll revisit this picture when we get to middle stage dementia. But again, these are individuals doing activities tailored to their ability, but it's within the context of a meaningful life role. And you can see when you get that just right challenge, you hit the mark and you can sustain the attention, sustain the activity, and promote health and well-being, as opposed to sometimes seeing this. And there are a lot of challenges, even in the early stages of dementia, with people initiating and participating in social engagement and contact, or a lot of challenges we see with caregivers knowing how to engage a person or understanding what their abilities are. And even though Alan calls it the cognitive disability model, she said she had to use the term disability so people would understand, but she really focused a lot on the abilities of the person. So we can view cognition in this model as a basic universal trait that underlies every human function. And a lot of times, um, cognition can be a useful piece of the puzzle in understanding a person. And I think that a lot of times people are misunderstood because of that. We don't, but a lot of times, even if you look at the can do and the will do, we're saying they won't do it or they can't do it. Or sometimes we're going to unpack some tailored activities with falls next week, and we a lot of times don't see that the cognitive function is contributing to the increased falls with people with dementia. So it's a useful piece. And even I think when physicians, especially on the annual wellness visit, they will ask people questions. And we now know that saying isn't always comparable to the doing. So sometimes people will say, no, I haven't had any falls, but maybe they've had 5. So it's really great to take a deeper dive into the cognition. And Alan described it as a restriction in voluntary motor action originating in the physical or chemical structures of the brain and producing observable limitations in routine task behavior. So the model looks at global brain function versus focal areas of the brain. And it says the global brain capacity is when the whole brain is operating as a total unit. It can be described as integrated functions of the brain's cognitive processing and their overall effect on behavior. And that doesn't mean that when working with individuals in the model, we can do other assessments may be needed to look at focal brain function, but it's a global brain that we're looking at. And here is a simplified version of the information processing that occurs when we're looking at activities and what we're evaluating. And basically, the process of cognition, and this is very basic, is sensory information comes into the nervous system, and we have to filter out competing stimuli in order to pay attention to what we're doing. And then if we are going on to learn something new, we have to use information, filter out information, use it, draw upon old information, hold it, manipulate it to understand it. We call that working memory. It uses a lot of energy. And then we transfer that to long-term memory. And when we have long-term memory, and we do things over and over. And this is contemporary neuroscience that's exploding with neuroplasticity and neurooccupation. But we're wiring that brain, and what fires together wires together. And the more a person does something, they have that hardwired route for what they're doing. And we call that procedural memory. And we're assessing that. So we are going to know what is new, what their capacity to learn is and to learn versus what is a procedural memory and a habit. And this is the difference between this is I think where many caregivers misunderstand what's going on, especially with their loved ones, where there's psychological denial and grief issues, and they can't always see it objectively. They think maybe mom or dad are doing much better than they actually are. So we can really hone in on the detail of that. But we also can uh, capitalize on those procedural memories, as we saw in that previous picture, in promoting engagement and positive health. So what influences the cognitive ability? Cognition is a dynamic process. So it's interpreted not as a static timestamp once you do an assessment. We know that stress and illness, medication, fatigue, and environmental factors are some of the main areas that affect our cognitive ability. And being intelligent doesn't always mean we have the ability to use functional cognition. So let's say after this presentation, you decided to go to the local pub and have a happy hour and drink a few drinks. The alcohol would affect your brain and it affects your brain function. And you can see if you drink too much, how you come right down on the scale with judgment, motor control, safety for driving. If you drink way too much, you can't walk and maybe you pass out. So you've come down this scale. And now, if the alcohol wears off, you will regain your function. So we are looking at all these factors in interpreting how a person is functioning and how we design our individual and organizational community programs as well. And this is, again, brain energy is another important concept. We know the brain uses an incredible amount of energy every day. You can learn something new or go to a course all day and you'll say, I didn't do anything, but why am I so tired? And so, again, as a person comes down on that scale, they have a less of an overall capacity to tolerate activity. And we can look at it we can overlap the cognitive and the physical. So here's an example with the comparable metabolic equivalent table intensities that were designed originally for people going through cardiac rehab. And they just measured them of how much activity and oxygen was needed to carry out a task. Well, we can see that even when we do our assessments or watch people, like I'll talk about this soon, but even asking someone to do some leather lacing, you can see for some people how much time, how much energy goes into it. And in using this, a lot of times I'll be asked to come and help someone who's resisting care or refusing a shower. And sometimes just shifting the time of when the person does it, when they're more rested, we have a better outcome and a better participation. So just a quick review here. The Allen Disability Model is an ordinal scale. We have those 6 levels, but they all have a name, and I'm going to go through them shortly. And there's also 27 modes of performance. So it's a very detailed scale, and these modes just give us uh, more specific levels to pay attention to. And people, what's really nice about this is that these levels are hierarchical and they're ordinal. So it's presumed in the theory. Let's say someone here on the scale is functioning at 4.6. So within that, they, in theory, they should function at every level below 4.6. So what's nice about that is if a person, maybe they are functioning at 4.6 and they can scan the environment, in theory, they should be able to walk from a cognitive perspective. And if they're not able to do that, we can then say, why not? Is there something we could do? Is this a missed opportunity for someone to use a capacity that they have? And also, what's nice about the modes, and they're flexible, people fluctuate within the modes, but they're very nice because in training caregivers, we can give a lot of detail. Like, let's say someone has a urinary tract infection, we can give detail for the person to observe when maybe they're dropping a little or maybe they're improving because of the medication. And again, just to review, we're looking at learning and the process of cognition, global brain function. We consider contextual factors. And again, in the literature and in the manuals with this, there's numerous guidelines for care and predicting function. And it's based on developmental theories, standardized and well-researched. So with that, we're going to go through the levels basically today, what the picture looks like, and talk about that in the trajectory of dementia. And then we're going to go into some of the assessments. But in level 6, which in theory is no cognitive disability, it's roughly associated with the global deterioration scale or fast stage 1, which is no cognitive decline or very mild cognitive decline. And at this level, that relevant information from memory can be self-activated without cues, and it can be used to complete complex activities and routines safely and correctly. A person can inhibit the external distractions and internal thoughts in order to remain functional in a variety of environments. So planning, learning, problem solving really don't depend on those explicit cues. And I always say if you play chess and you're functioning in level 6, you think ahead. If I make this move, what might happen in the next 1 or 2 moves before you make that move? So they can plan ahead. Executive functions are in order. Also, the person can process abstract thinking, which could be reading subtle social cues. They have empathy and they can rise above their own needs to help someone else. They can understand someone else's point of view, even if they have different opinion. So there's flexibility in their social relationships. They can analyze facts and think ahead. When we now talk about level 5, which is associated with mild cognitive impairment, and there are a certain percentage of people, older adults, who develop mild cognitive impairment. Some of them do lead to dementia, but not all. And I think this is a critical time if someone is diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment to have a whole plan for them. Because, again, if we look at all the science that's coming out on brain health and lifestyle, which includes social engagement, cognitive stimulation, exercise, um, all those things, we can help someone get in a healthy pattern because not all people go into full blown dementia. So it's a critical time. And information processing begins to slow down and the working memory is affected. And so we'll see that with someone's ability to plan and reason, think about new situations, novel problem solving is kind of the hallmark when looking at that. And multitasking, task switching begins to become problematic, and judgment and executive function. So these challenges impact performance during complex tasks and contribute to difficulty with the person seeing the whole picture or processing abstract information or planning ahead. And again, what a person may use to figure out something is trial and error. And they don't think ahead and think of the secondary consequences, so they may be labeled as impulsive or careless. Um, they may have trouble getting their work done because they're slowing down in some of that divided attention. Uh, they may have more social issues where they have feelings of personal rights if they're in a social group or circle and their social norms aren't the same as the other, they might have some conflict. They may say insensitive or frank or blunt comments, and have some difficulty understanding other people's needs. And in order to cope with that, you may see ultimatums or blaming other. So we can see these modes, and at the lower end of the scale, you see the higher end of the scale, they're going to consult with others. They're going to consider the social standards. Those are big hallmarks. And consulting with others is a great milestone in terms of having a really good relationship in a therapeutic context. At 5.2 is a hallmark regarding divided attention and doing two things at once. There are studies in dementia showing slower gait stride when people are talking and walking. And we can observe this in a clinical observation. If someone is living in a community and they're below 5.2, you might not see a lot of conversation during at the dining table while they're eating. If they drive a car and they function at that level and there's distraction or they're talking, they might drive the car slower. If they are a clerk at the store, at the checkout counter, and people are talking to them, they may work at a slower pace. So that's a marker and an observation. And then we know in the ordinal scale, anything below that, people are going to have difficulty with divided attention. The next level, level 4, and at that level, we're starting to get into more noticeable functional areas of difficulty. People are maybe getting a diagnosis. There's a lot of uncertainty and ambivalence with families and caregivers because you will see some areas where the person still, they can talk really well. They're living maybe a less complex life, and yet there's still some performance errors in their daily activities. Um, at this level, it's associated with the global deterioration fast stages 4 and 5, and we're seeing more moderate decline. um, and difficulty with well, they're still goal directed, so they know how to sequence through the steps of a familiar activity. So procedural processing remains intact, and but there is some difficulty processing uh, higher level verbal information, visual and contextual cues, noticing details, inhibiting irrelevant cues. So they best respond to the external concrete visual cue. And I always say the best way to look at that is out of sight, out of mind. And we're going to see difficulty with some depth perception, perceiving what's behind closed doors, and maybe someone's forgetting to change their underwear or put their socks on. But if you put it in plain view, it's enough of a recognition cue to stimulate them to do the activity. The other way I describe that, it's the difference between an essay test and a multiple choice. So we need those recognition cues. We know that there's a slowed response time and there's difficulty in understanding the change in the abilities. So concrete thinking is a hallmark as well. And if we look at that biopsychosocial approach, a lot of times we explain the reason why someone needs to do something or the reason why we're working with them. And if someone has an agreeable personality, they'll nod their head, they'll say okay, but they might not fully understand what you're saying. Other people, they might not understand and they may feel threatened by that, and they may protect their fragile sense of self, and they may just refuse everything altogether. But this is what is a common theme in this level 4. And the person does great with routines and consistency so that they can count on what's next and what's happening. They may self or do their self-care using old habits. Again, when they're coming into a new environment or we're changing that, we can't expect that they're automatically going to adapt without some help. They may interrupt or ask repeated questions, and they process time in increments of an hour. So, what does that look like? In my earlier days in my career, I did a lot of home health care in a rural area, and I had several people that I worked with functioning at this level. They weren't diagnosed with dementia, though, but they were all functioning at this level. And if if it was hard in home care because if someone else was coming, they're like, you can't come, someone else is coming. Or the hardest thing for me was competing with the Price is Right. Uh, it was on at 11 o'clock and you can't come. I need to watch the Price is Right. And I would explain to them, I'll be here at 9 o'clock. I'll be done at 10. You'll have a whole hour. And some people just could not have the flexibility to understand what I was saying or to understand that it might not be feasible to come back in the afternoon. So I had another therapist say when she was working with a family and she started learning about the processing the time and training the family. They had mom who they said, we're taking you out to the restaurant at 2 p.m. And at 9 a.m., she was up, dressed, had her coat on and her purse, and was sitting in the chair waiting because, again, that processing that time wasn't fully there. The other thing here, you can see this sequence of the performance mode and completing the goals in the middle, the hallmark of the level. At the higher level, we say they can scan the environment, which means they can perceive what's behind them. And at the lower level, they're starting to need more assistance um, to do their activities and to problem solve and notice. But what we know, because we're looking at global cognitive abilities, we can look at visual attention with this model. And when we say scans the environment at 4.6, we mean that the person can perceive that there is something behind them. And if they think to look for something, they know that they can look behind them to look. But as they come down the scale at 4.4, they're paying attention to 3 to 4 feet in front of them. So objects that are needed, maybe a walker or daily ADL devices, they have to be in front of the person. At 4.2, we know it's 24 inches. On the dominant side, 4.0, it's 24 inches. And even as we go down the scale, it gets narrower and narrower. And again, so thinking about that and knowing that, there's a lot that we can do in the environment to support the person, even in the environment where there's noise or people talking. And again, they can't perceive that space completely. The other thing, knowing that we can gain and maintain attention before talking to the person and get in front of them. So here's just an example of a gentleman who's functioning in the lower end of 4, and we're going to talk about this program next week. He was participating in an adaptive work program. He had a lot of issues with elopement, and the year before he came into the assisted environment, he was having hospitalizations for mental health. And what we did was we adapted a meaningful activity like the tailored activity program. And he was a businessman and had a lot of his own companies. And we put this in the context of a routine. We knew that we could engage him, especially in his acuity times after meals. And it kept him interested, happy, and engaged for a long time. He did not have any more of his mental health hospitalizations, and we managed the need to want to elope. So to level 3 now, and that is called manual actions. It's associated with the global deterioration scale and the fast stage level 6. We're having more cognitive decline. The person is losing awareness of goals and outcomes. They are doing more repetitive actions and familiar objects that can be touched, and tactile cues promote attention, but also objects can be a recognition cue. So placing it in their hand, a brush, they might do it. Sometimes we might have to use the tactile cue to help them. And they easily become overwhelmed by the excess stimuli, especially the noise in the environment. So at level 3, the person is handling objects, they have repetitive actions, they are no longer goal directed. So they aren't able to sequence through the steps of the activities. They can become easily confused, especially if you change environments. They're not likely to ask for assistance. And again, that visual attention is in front. So what they're thinking about is feeling and moving, identifying objects, the cause and effect on the objects, and the neurobiologic wanting to touch and feel and do. So again, this becomes problematic at this stage because as we go through this, they have less of an ability to hold information and time. And so they can sit for long periods of time and not have the ability to know that lunch is coming in 20 minutes or what they did 5 minutes ago. And here's an example of a group of therapist who designed a program for people at this stage. The ladies were lined up in the hall waiting to get their hair done. And they didn't realize that they were getting their hair done because they would forget. And so they came up with a few activities to engage them while they were waiting. And this is just an example. And in level 3, again, we see those modes of performance, and we can see they're going to sustain the action on the object, usually for about a minute. And at 3.6, they're going to note the effect of their action on the object. And at 3.8, they use all the objects to sense completion of an activity. And in here is an assessment that we use, a placemat assessment, and they copy that design. And we have one right here today, and they fringe in glue. And at the higher end of the scale, you can see this pattern of performance that they use all the objects to sense completion, but they're not goal directed to complete the task. And at the lower end, at 3.2, they're going to, you might even have to place the object in their hand and they may do a little bit of it and then stop. At 3.4, what we're watching for is sustaining the action for at least a minute. And 3.6, they're going to note effects of their action on objects. So in bathing, we can see that pattern again. You have to put the washcloth in their hand. They might drop it. At 3.2, they might adjust their grasp and have minimal movement. 3.4, they may do it in one spot over and over. 3.6, they may move it around. And at 3.8, they may link it together, but they may forget different parts. But you can see that in oral care and other activities. So level 2, now we're getting into the later stages of dementia and the GDS fast stage. Level 7, they're focused on internal cues and sensations and proprioception. They're working on comfort and movement, and objects no longer serve as recognition cues. At this point, I see a lot of caregivers really struggle when a person goes from level 3 to level 2, because before we could engage a person in repetitive activities, now they a lot of struggle of what can we do? But they respond more to gross motor movement, safety, comfort, positioning. We need to keep them connected on an emotional level because they have difficulty perceiving themselves separate from the environment, and keep them connected. So again, here are our levels and our modes. 2.4 is the hallmark, it's walking. As we get to the higher end, they may walk to a location, but at 2.8, we're going to see this death grip on a bar or an object, but we might not see the fluid release. So that's the difference between someone in level 2 and level 3. So we can observe that, and they functionally grasp or release. Uh, and here, sensory programs are great. We're going to get into a lot of this next week. And gross motor activities to capture their attention. I put a list here, but next week we're going to talk a lot more about it. But there's a lot of things that we can engage the person in. And here is a scale of just the progression of the motor skills, just for you to take a quick look. And at level 1, now we're at the later to end stages of dementia. The person's pretty much bedbound. It's severe functional decline associated with GDS and fast stage 7. There's minimal response to the environment. Most of the attention is subliminal or internal cues like pain and hunger and smell. And their actions are in response to comfort and discomfort. They can maybe locate strong stimuli. We're focused on sustaining life, positioning, but again, comfort care and emotional connection, not to disengage with a person because they're not responding. They need a lot of care and attention. So we can see the scale and this how detailed it is. So we can watch those changes from responding to stimuli right down to withdrawing. And a few more minutes to go through the assessment tools, and then we'll pause and have some dialogue about this. And I'm going to highlight some of the key tools here that are used in the model: the routine task inventory, the leather lacing, and the Allen-Dine-Dasnik module. And again, what are we measuring? Cognitive processes observed in patterns of performance during functional tasks, and they're observed in a hierarchical scale, and they're graded by increasingly complex behavior. So the routine task inventory is an assessment task. It has 3 components where it's a self-report, a caregiver report, and a therapist report. There's 26 activities within 4 categories, and it evaluates all of the levels. And it's really designed not to be done in one sitting, because we're looking at patterns of performance or behavior across a context. And there's a lot of wonderful clinical utility because you can do all three reports and then say what is the person's observation of their ability, what's the caregiver's, and then what is the semi um, standardized objective of the therapist. And then there is the Allen Level Cognitive Screen, which is the leather lacing. There's a large version and a small version. There is more research on the smaller version, so they recommend starting with that if you can. But the large version was developed for individuals with hand difficulties or maybe some vision difficulties. It is standardized and it's for levels 3, 4, and 5. And they also have a disposable version now. So that really helps during the times of COVID. And then finally, the Allen Diagnostic Module are standardized and provide opportunities for individuals to do new activities, problem solving. They also produce something that they might like or that's safe and attractive. So as they're standardized and they produce predictable problems to solve, and they come with instructions, and you can do it individually or in small groups. You can see um, it comes with a lot of information about what you're observing while you're looking, and also a scoring criteria. And here's just an example, again, looking at the placemat and the performance on the placemat, and based on all the criteria, fringing, gluing, placing, you can assign a score to the person. And just another example of what that might look like again at 3.8. Here's the frog note holders. I'm just going to go through a few of these, and you can see in the lower end of the screen what might be some of the results of what you get. Um, and here's a ribbon assessment. Most of the time, in the original use of this, they would do a screen score with the leather lacing and then appropriately select the ADM project. And here's another one. We can see patterns of performance again. The tile box here, someone may start out copying that pattern, but then they can't maintain it. So they have an irregular pattern. But again, we can look at cognitive endurance and how that may carry out in other activities or in the community through the holistic context. And there's been a study correlating the performance on the tile box with community placement of adults in mental health. So we interpret it, we can look at regular patterns, and we know that some of our regular patterns vary in the day, could be fatigue or medication cycles. We can look at irregular patterns, which may be response to different caregivers and environments, or medical instability, maybe unstable blood sugar, and noting subtle changes in attention and fluctuating skills. Changes in routine can cause agitation. And we can also say, will the person have a consistent functional gain? May they improve with healing or medication? And even if they have a progressive type of dementia, sometimes they are hospitalized or they have a UTI or a pneumonia, and that level comes down. We can meet them where they're at and maybe have an expectation that they might come up. And then we can also say there might be just a consistent functional loss based on understanding the disease progression. And finally, with the can do, will do, may do, I added this. There's numerous tools out there, role assessments, lifestyle profiles, um, but to begin to take that person-centered information in this biopsychosocial holistic approach and look at the person's history, culture, education, their preferences, their work and leisure and home activities, what type of behavioral reactions do they have or did they have? Sensory likes and dislikes, which become critical, especially at the lower end of the scale, habits and routines. Again, level 4, that's where they're going to thrive. and then personality and coping style. All that information goes in back to that can do, will do, may do to design that just right fit. And so there's a quick overview on the fundamentals of this theory with dementia.